this as well. So welcome everyone. Hi comrades, friends. Hi to our distinguished panelists that I will present shortly. Before presenting our distinguished speakers, I'd like to just make a few introductory notes about what we're going to discuss tonight. So
I think this is better.
Okay. The socialist tradition and its Marxist strand more specifically has always been centered around the critique of capitalism to denaturalize this mode of production. It has meant to show its incompatibility with a life devoid of exploitation and oppression. And as the existential threat of the ecological crisis intensifies, the possibility of life itself. So the crisis of capitalist production, of reproductive care, and the conditions for the reproduction of the planet makes not only another world possible, but makes socialism more urgently necessary than ever. The Socialist Project, as framed within the Marxist, the classical Marxist tradition, had always been underdeveloped. As Marx famously said, this exercise was seen as an effort to develop, as he said, quote, recipes for the cookshops of the future, end quote. But with the bureaucratic failures of real socialism and social democracy in the 20th century, this has created a crisis of socialist imagination. This is why this conference, and most of all this 2021 edition, as Paolo said, has put an emphasis on the need to revisit and develop both broad and more concrete institutional configurations of what democratic socialism might look like in the 21st century. Because this has become a central task of the socialist movement in order to break with a sense of overwhelming fatalism. In other words, we need to know better where we want to go in order to re-inspire sustained cycles of bold and mass struggles that pushes the boundaries of the limits of the possible and that are informed by a rejuvenated socialist compass that guides us on how to get there. So while our great speakers of tonight will probably give us some elements of how to renew the Socialist Project, I think that those most eager to learn more about the intricacies of the socialist models for the 21st century should not miss notably the 3 panels on Sunday that looks into planning and markets on how to incorporate ecological limits within issues of democratic planning and how we might use technology in a socialist direction. Because this panel is called Advancing Towards Socialism. In other words, its central question is how we might get to socialism, as broadly defined as the production for social needs rather than profit. In this sense, this panel will illuminate the actual terrain we're trying to navigate in all this fog. This implies to look at the actual trajectory of capitalism and its crisis in recent decades, how within this broad process, exploitation and oppression has been transformed by patterns of class deformation and reformation. What are the actual impossible forms of mass struggles that rebuild and will rebuild class power in a broad sense at different sites of anti-capitalist resistance, from the workplace, the household, struggles for around the immigration status, to the fight against landlords, police brutality, wars, and extractivist projects. In other words, some of the broad and concrete questions that I think our panelists will most urgently address tonight will be why socialism is necessary today more than ever in the face of capitalism's multiple contradictions and failures. And what are the actual constraints capitalism poses in this moment for its eventual transcendence through a socialist transition? If this crisis of capitalism compromises the politics of reformism, and that the space for meaningful reforms is smaller than before, are still struggles for reforms necessary to build the kind of class solidarities we need, the know-how, the confidence that can prefigure a rupture with capitalism, given that we are far from a revolutionary crisis period. Also, what is the actual obstacles to build meaningful class solidarities that cuts across gender, sexual, and race lines? What are the kind of particular and universal demands that need to be articulated if we are to build an organic unity of the diverse? I mean, in the sense of building class unity in all its diversity that contests exploitation and oppression in and outside the workplace. What are the kind of struggles in recent decades that have been most promising and advancing in this direction across the world, and from which we can draw strategic lessons for our next movements? Also, what are the Black, woman, queer, indigenous, and global South Marxist traditions upon which we can rely upon and build from to inform such practical struggles? And finally, and I'll stop there, what are the organizational forms we need to sustain mass struggles that can help us advance towards socialism? What type of party do we need, and what lessons do we draw from the recent cycle of radical left parties? Because we are in a cycle where, what are the future prospects of such parties following the defeat of Syriza, the crisis of Pink Tide, and the defeat of Corbyn and the Sanders campaign most recently? What are the relationship between broad left parties, mass struggles, and the possibility of creating new revolutionary parties in the future? This, I assume, will be more or less the hot topics discussed by our guest speakers tonight. So without taking more of your time, I'll introduce our guest speakers of tonight. So we'll start with Robert Brenner. Welcome, Robert. I think it's the first time you're technically in Montreal. So Robert Brenner is director of the Center for Social Theory and Comparative History at UCLA. He is the author of many books that have sparked two major debates, the transition to capitalism debate, which can be found in the book called The Brenner Debate, Agrarian Class Structure and Economic Development in Pre-Industrial Europe, and Merchants and Revolution. The other concerns the trajectory of contemporary capitalism in the second half of the 20th century, covered in his books, The Economics of Global Turbulence and The Boom and the Bubble. I think it's this latter debate that Bob will touch most upon in his talk today and draw conclusions for a socialist movement. Our second speaker will be ASAD HAIDER. ASAD HAIDER is the founding editor of Viewpoint magazine and the author of Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump. And if I'm not mistaken, I think, ASAD, you're working on a sequel that should come out with a slightly different name this fall called Mistaken Identity on the Ideology of Race and Class.
New edition, updated, yeah.
It's an updated edition, yeah, exactly. So his writing can also be found in the Baffler, N+1, The Point, Salon, and elsewhere. Finally, Holly Lewis is our last speaker, is an assistant professor of philosophy at Texas State University and the author of the book called The Politics of Everybody, Feminism, Queer Theory, and Marxism at the Intersection. She is best known for her contributions exploring the relationship between feminism, queer politics, and Marxist politics. And she's also on the editorial board of the new Spectre Journal, which was supposed to be launched officially at our conference in 2020, which is sponsoring a series of panels this weekend, including this one, if I'm correct, right? Perfect. So just to let know everyone, we'll have 20-minute presentations for each of our panelists. Then I'll give you a few minutes to respond to each other, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the room. All right. So Robert, it's up to you. Just need to turn on your volume, Robert. We don't hear you. Maybe at the bottom, just on the left side, Bob, you need to activate your sound.
Let's get you back.
Okay, there we are.
Are we okay? This is the cost you pay for inviting someone from the late 19th century. Okay. As I was saying, I want to thank Paolo and Christian for those great introductions, and I particularly want to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me. I mean, it's a fantastic opportunity. I think it's going to be a very exciting weekend, and hopefully it will spur enough of further dynamism and interest to build meetings which we all can actually attended person in the not too distant future. I don't want to guess when exactly that would be, but I really want to thank the organizers, and I really am very excited to be able to be here. Okay. Marx and Engels' initial presentation of the transition to socialism, notably in the Communist Manifesto, was, as we know, a little bit paradoxically, but not really, one of the most effusive paeans to capitalism ever penned. The two young revolutionaries, neither of them yet 30 years old when they wrote the manifesto, interpreted capitalism as a world historical force for progress, for developing the productive forces, and thus for creating the conditions for constructing socialism. So understanding in capitalism in this manner opened the way to viewing socialism as not about developing production, which would inevitably mean involving the working class, in Marx's words, unpublished they were, in the same old shit of exploitation, but about realizing a good society. This would be a society with equality and workers' self-rule as its political premises, but even more to the point, one which would be about ending work as a necessity, making possible ever more free or leisure time, and above all, about making developing human capacities, human creativity, the job of society, the individuals in society responsible for society, and vice versa in this fundamental respect. Now, this division of historical function between capitalism and socialism was not only Marx and Engels' premise in the middle of the 19th century, but that of the classical socialist movement, and indeed the socialist movement for much of its history. By the same token, not just the theoretical understanding of socialism, but day-to-day oppositional politics, working class politics for most of its history, also has had as its often unstated premise that capitalism was bringing about, as a general trend, economic advance. Working people fight for a better life, and they do so on the implicit assumption that improvements in living standards and working conditions that they are aiming at are realistic goals, given the fact of capitalism's material progress, or given what was that fact. Of course, capitalists can never be expected to grant reforms without a fight, but when the economy is growing and profitability is reasonably high, employers can find it in their own interest to pay a certain price in terms of compensation to workers in order to minimize the cost of disruption to production that they would have to absorb if they tried to prevent workers' gains entirely. So I don't think there's ever been any sort of accord in which capitalists and workers agree on rising productivity and rising gains, anything like that. But in a period of economic advance, the pressures on profitability on the one hand, and the possibilities for better living and working standards for workers are much more on the agenda. On the other hand, and equally important, the struggle for reforms is not counterposed to revolution. In the course of struggle at the level of the workplace, the trade union, the mass strike, working people create collective practices that provide more realistic material bases for creating more powerful working class institutions, and in turn, holding radical, ultimately socialist ideas. So the the struggle for reforms, the class struggle, is at its best the ground for a practice that makes for greater power for the working class. That greater power makes for possibilities of transformed consciousness, transformed politics, and ultimately for socialist ideas. So without belaboring this point, capitalist material advance was a premise for working class struggle, both day-to-day politics and transition to socialism for a very long epoch, and has never ceased consciously to be so. We can see this in the classic social democratic labor movement in the era leading to World War I. And the same thing was assumed to be true for politics in most of the developed capitalist world in the epoch after World War II, which started out with a very extended period of boom, the so-called golden age, when capitalist expansion was the expectation and the assumption. To the extent then that there has ever been a science of radical politics that had any purchase on significant parts of the working class, it was mainly built consciously, unconsciously, intentionally, unintentionally on the premise of capitalist economic advance. Nevertheless, quickly get to the bottom line. The problem is that in contemplating the transition to socialism today, as for example, at our conference here, we face, as we have long faced, a qualitatively different situation that we on the left and in the working class movement have largely failed consciously to recognize, let alone to consciously put front and center and make the point of departure for our politics. This is the fact of long-term capitalist stagnation and crisis. Astoundingly, for over 50 years, business cycle by business cycle, we've experienced ever worsening performance of the global economy as a whole. And this has been accompanied by generally stagnant or worsening living standards. It's true, of course, that for part of this period, the generalized worldwide systemic slowdown has been partially counterbalanced, I emphasize partially, by the spectacular speed up of economic development in selected regions, above all East Asia, and especially the Chinese Leviathan. These regions experienced historic breakthroughs, historic speeds of growth and corresponding social development to an important extent by seizing the markets from advanced capitalist economies. But the fundamental point, that was true, that can't deny that, and it needs to be put front and center because it's, of course, one of the most important features of our time, especially of the last half century. But the fundamental point is that the growth of these specific economies was nowhere near great enough to be able to prevent generalized global deceleration. And I'm not going to do too much of this, but I hope I would be grateful if the organizers could put up table 1 that I sent along. Maybe they can't. Yeah, that's it. So this will just, don't want to, again, I'm not going to belabor this point, but I think it needs to be seen. This is the world growth of GDP and manufacturing output. And people can see that step by step, the direction is downward, ultimately reaching the worst point in the last long cycle from 2008 roughly to the present. So people can take a look at this for the minute. Hopefully we can drop it pretty quickly. In any case, in the last decade and a half or so, since the Great Recession of 2007-9, we've had an actually stagnant and crisis-bound world economy everywhere. Little growth, little development of the productive forces anywhere. A system-wide productivity crisis as exemplary or as symptomatic. Capitalist dynamism has virtually disappeared, most obviously in the so-called advanced capitalist economies of the US, Europe, and Japan, but also in what were only a short time ago, the dynamic East Asian economies, above all China, while promising capitalist development or capitalist advances in places like Brazil, Latin America, South Africa. These two have been pretty much constrained, if not totally snuffed out. It seems to me that this transformed situation of decline, stagnation, and crisis has to be at the heart of our politics, our point of departure, but that up to now, it has not been. Capitalism as a global system has not, for a very long time, been carrying out its historical mission or shown itself to be capable of doing that. So at the heart of capitalist evolution, throughout the whole of the period since World War II, has been the buildup of world overcapacity, which it's crucial to see has bit by bit engulfed everyone, not just in, again, the so-called developed economies of the so-called West, but also a funny West that includes Japan, but also East Asia and China and beyond. So the story of development since 1950 has been that one after another manufacturing national economy has entered the world market, not by taking their assigned place in the world division of labor, a la Adam Smith. Rather, they've done so by borrowing advanced technologies from the leaders and combining them with low wages and costs. On this basis, they have produced the same goods that were already being produced, but they've done so more cheaply, especially by producing them for export and seizing shares of the world market from the incumbents. This has meant supply outrunning demand, putting downward pressure on prices, forcing many to limit their utilization of capacity. This has meant overcapacity, bringing about downward pressure on profitability, making the reality of decreasing returns difficult to avoid anywhere. So we've had this long line: Germany, Japan, East Asian NICs, East Asian Tigers, China, and beyond that, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and I'm just sort of trying to indicate the direction where things have gone. But we've seen then this progression, but there's been a huge problem. The difficulties that overcapacity, the difficulty has been that this has meant growing overcapacity. Growing overcapacity has made it ever more difficult to make profits, and that has led to reduced investment and growth. Smaller surpluses have been available, and producers are aware that it's likely to be hard to realize any investment that they make at a given point in time, because lower cost producers are likely to come onto the market and outcompete them by producing at a still lower cost. The point is, again, is not simply here, not simply that one region of the world is doing well at the expense of the others. So it is that the whole system, everyone, has been gripped by the tendency to declining dynamism resulting from overcapacity. That has made for pressure on profits in surpluses available, in prospects, and in turn has meant a slowing down of investment, economic slowdown. It's not a question of the type of capitalism or the policy. Every type has failed, and so have the various policy variants. Keynesian demand subsidies to counter supposed underconsumption. Supply side industrial policy, as in the organized capitalism of East Asia, have not been done much better. The profound slowdown in China itself, really an incipient crisis since 2011, 2012, has, in my opinion, instantiated this point to a T. So the starting point of our political practice and view of the transition to socialism has to be the failure of capitalism. But the problem is that capitalist decline has had paradoxical, contradictory consequences that don't make socialist politics today an easy prospect. On the one hand, capitalism's horrific performance has discredited capitalism as a system, because economic progress and the growth of living standards was capitalism's historic justification. So the system has undermined itself, not just because of its inability to deal with the gigantic overriding issues of the pandemic and climate change, but its inability to succeed in its own terms of being able to deliver the goods. This literal bottom line failure of capitalism has made socialism a truly practical prospect, and we have not, I believe, we on the left have not emphasized this anywhere near enough. But on the other hand, paradoxically, the failure of capitalism poses huge difficulties for us because it means we need new conceptions of day-to-day politics. Remember, for most of socialist history, the progress delivered by capitalism not only put socialism and the transition to socialism on the agenda, but also made the struggle for reforms easier to think about, the question of strategy and tactics more manageable. But the problem is that this is no longer a reality. Above all, for a very long time, as no one at this conference needs to be told, capitalists in their state have not only fought against reforms tooth and nail, but put austerity and take back at the core of their agenda. Cuts in wages and social spending, subsidies for capitalists, tax cuts for capitalists, privilege and protection to the employers and their profits. So it's been very hard to fight for reforms at every level, shop floor, trade union, the state, because winning demands has required very broad mass mobilizations, which in turn imply discontinuities in that are not easy to manufacture. Meanwhile, the ruling classes have universally adopted what I think is not any longer all that helpfully called neoliberalism. This means in part, of course, globalization by the free movement of investment and trade. That's a big deal still. It also means in part deregulation and privatization, especially if we understand that those are about being other ways to cut the cost of production. And finally, part of the ruling class's armory, I would say the establishment's dirty little secret, except that it is at this point a secret from absolutely no one, is that politicians of the establishment political parties, right and left, have nurtured an alliance of top managers, the wealthy, and politicians to forge directly political means to funnel income and wealth to the top 1% and above, while treating the well-being of the economy and the rest of the population as at best a second thought. So we've had, in addition to helping capitalism through austerity and privatization and deregulation, cutting out the whole problem of production per se, and simply directly through political means funneling income and wealth to the top 1% and above. So the question is, what should be the driving force of our politics, our tactics right now? Neoliberalism, I can't emphasize enough, despite many interesting things that are happening. I don't have time to go into them now, but neoliberalism is very much still here and will be until it's politically challenged across the board. That hasn't happened yet. Just whatever interesting things are going on, people probably know what I'm referring to and what I don't have time to talk about here for the minute. But the neoliberalism's failure to provide for the population has absolutely structured mass politics in an ever greater way. On the one hand, obviously, the rise of the authoritarian right, Trump and all that, MAGA politics, which has meant organizing on the basis of racism, on the basis of patriarchal power, on the basis of right-wing religion, nationalism in the form of anti-immigration. This set of politics speaks to a clear minority, diminishing minority of the population, of the electorate, so to speak. And it has the incredible advantage of doing so while making it clear that there is no challenge implied to capitalism or capitalist profits. On the other hand, we've also had an encouraging left-wing response to neoliberalism from Sanders, AOC, and all that. But I think it doesn't have to be said at great length to people here. That has shown or had the weakness of dependence on what the Democratic Party wants to do, dependence on the Democrats, and in turn on electoral parliamentary road, which has never, in a periods of crisis like this, been sufficient. Always, whatever else we've needed for politics in periods like this one, parliament, elections, which can play a very important role, those are only possible, only become truly useful with the rise of mass movements. And this is where the difficulty of the problem of discontinuity comes into effect. Still, that is how difficult that is, meaning how difficult it is to organize when you're trying to get beyond a sectional trade union struggle on the one hand, or get beyond depending on elections, which don't really require any change or much change in practical activity of the sort that can provide the basis for growing mass working class power and in turn new ideas. So what we have faced, therefore, is precisely overcoming that discontinuity that is needed for a more powerful mass politics. But, and I want to move to conclusion here at this point. One can say, as someone like Rosa Luxemburg did, that capitalism moves, the mass struggle moves discontinuously, and organizing discontinuously for mass action is exceedingly difficult. However, if anything has, if there's been any lesson, it seems to me, of the last decade or so, since basically the crisis, the Great Recession, 2007 to 9, and the discrediting, especially of Obama, which held things up in the US and on a world scale in a huge way. Nonetheless, in this last decade, we've seen an incredibly encouraging and incredibly, promising, fertile series of gigantic struggles. Occupy was just about everywhere, as we're learning as that history gets written. Black Lives Matter movement was the greatest ever, as far as I know, and I think it's been clear, in the history of the United States. Meanwhile, on a world scale, we've moved from, at the time of the crisis, Tahrir Square, Syntagma Square, the Indignados in Spain, massive movements, not to mention in the most recent period, 2018, 2019, just before the pandemic, Lebanon, Chile, Iraq, France, Puerto Rico, absolutely gigantic mass struggles that have had the potential to shake those regimes. Where next? I think I've hit my deadline. I've hit the point where I have to subside. But I think what the final thing that comes to the fore and is of crucial importance for this conference and makes what this conference is trying to do so central is that what we have to be thinking about is the conditions of capitalism in decline, capitalism stagnation, capitalism in crisis. These are creating the conditions more or less permanently, although not the struggles permanently, the possibility permanently. Just look at the last long period of stagnation, the interwar period in the 20s and 30s, when this was also a reality. What we have is an expectation of these such struggles. But I think and this is, going to may raise some hackles, or on the other hand, might command agreement as obvious. What we have to be thinking about under these conditions is how we want to think about, on the one hand, the new forms, institutions of struggle that are inevitably being thrown up on the one hand, and what are the forms of socialism that we can put forward in the course of those struggles, so as not to lose both of these things, not to lose the gains of these struggles, which we know, if there's no further action, will be lost, will be episodic. So I think the question of socialist politics, what is the socialism of what are going to be huge mass movements, has to be on the agenda, that as the nature of the struggle for reforms today. We never get beyond the struggle for reforms. And then secondly, in that context, how to think about the socialist society that I think has been that question, I think, has been very much lost and has to be put on the agenda again. This, I think, is the purpose of this conference as I understand it. And I'm very optimistic about, for that reason, about what can be accomplished here, even if it's inevitable that it will be baby steps. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert Brenner. This was very exciting, covering a lot. I think we'll be able to pick up a lot of those themes in the discussions to come, and probably Holly and ASAD will also pick up some of these issues and expand. So the next person to talk is ASAD HAIDER. So it's up to you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks to the comrades who have organized this conference. It's a kind of a difficult position to be in, to follow Robert Brenner, just because most of us don't have a debate named after us. And so it seems a little unfair. And I feel now that I need to present a new position on the transition from feudalism to capitalism for this to really be worth the audience's time. But I will, there's a story I like about May 1968 in Paris, that Jean-Paul Sartre goes to speak to the student occupation of the Odéon. And he goes up to the podium and there's a note that says, "Sartre, be brief." And so this is not 1968, I am not Jean-Paul Sartre, but I will try to be brief, but to touch on the fundamental questions. I've been very preoccupied, as I'm sure many of you have also been in the past week or so, with the events in Gaza, the destruction of Gaza. And there's just been a ceasefire declared. So this is a good thing. But the problem remains very much on my mind. And there is an interesting question, a set of questions about what is the relationship of socialist politics? What are the ways that Marxist theory relates to questions of this kind, to events of this kind? And I think sometimes we see a certain weakness or a certain indecision about how to understand these things. There may be, for example, a kind of impulse among Marxists to say that ultimately we need to present an underlying economic explanation for any political event, any political problem, in order to relate to it as socialists, communists, Marxists. And this made me think of going back to the entire discussion, starting from Marx and going through the whole history of the international socialist movement, of the national question. And, you know, I read a short story by Ghassan Kanafani, Letter from Gaza, which made an impression. I recommend reading it. And he talks about, it's a letter from someone in Gaza to a friend of his who has left, who is in California. He is thinking about going to California. He says he wanted to liberate himself from defeat, to escape. And, but then he goes to the hospital to visit his niece, who threw herself on top of her brothers and sisters to protect them from bombs and flames and so on, and has lost her leg. And he says, "I'm not leaving now, and you come back and learn from my niece's amputated leg what life and existence are." And it was very an uncanny repetition of some lines of Marx in a speech he gave in 1867 on the Irish question. And he said that the Irish question it's not only a question of nationality, but a question of land and existence. And another point, that we have two records of this speech. One is his notes, and another is a summary written by someone in the audience, which was something like the Communist Education Association of German Workers in London. And so one formulation is land and existence, another is existence and life and death are the forms of the national question. And so what's fascinating about this is that Marx has just presented, this is December 1867, he has just in September published Capital, first volume of Capital. So it's right after presenting his systematic critique of political economy that Marx becomes extremely preoccupied with the Irish question, with the question of English colonialism and the Irish national liberation struggle. And it is in his political interventions in the international, the research he does, historical research, in his correspondence with Engels and others. And he presents some points of analysis that have become very famous. One kind of language he uses is that he says, you know, the English working class is not going to be able to achieve a revolution. It's not going to be able to emancipate itself, to have social emancipation, until there is Irish independence. And so this is a point he makes with a couple, let's say there are two angles of the analysis. One is a kind of analysis of what are the objective material conditions for a revolution. And so he makes a point. He has a kind of assumption which has been there for a long time in his thinking, which is that it's at the most advanced level of capitalist development that you have the most mature conditions, material conditions for revolution. And so that is in England. England has the most mature conditions for a social revolution, for the working class revolution. And yet this level of development, he says, because it is tied up with this colonial relation of England to Ireland, means that the Irish question, the national question, has come to predominate over the class struggle in England, in the sense that the class struggle in England cannot proceed until there has been Irish national liberation. And he calls it, he uses two mechanical metaphors. One is of a lever. The lever is in Ireland. The other is that it's the weakest point of England. And this may remind some of you of the idea of the Russian Revolution as taking place at the weak link in the imperialist chain, rather than at the higher level of capitalist development in Germany. And so he presents this analysis in terms of how is it that the English aristocracy and bourgeoisie profit from colonialism in Ireland, and how that is the basis of the system continuing. But then there's a second kind of analysis, which is about the working class. And it's the idea that the antagonism between English and Irish workers is a fundamental block on the development of the class struggle in England. The English working class, because it views itself as having a kind of religious, social, national superiority over the Irish, and because then the Irish view the English workers as tools of the English ruling class, that this has actually blocked the power of the working class. It sees as the source of the impotence of the working class, their powerlessness, and that is the secret of the power of the ruling class. And he says this has rendered the working class impotent despite its organization. So he specifies this. And so what's interesting about his analysis here is that, first of all, while he does maintain this presupposition, which is certainly most dramatically representative of the Communist Manifesto, that revolution will happen at the highest level of capitalist development, he nevertheless then says that even if that's the case, the lever is in Ireland, the weak point is in Ireland. First, you need to have national liberation, then you can have the social revolution. And he says that, so the most mature conditions, the mature material conditions for revolution have this kind of paradoxical quality, because that level of development has generated a weak point where the lever is. And then despite the organization of the working class, the fact that the working class is organized to engage in class struggle, it's powerless because of this division, which is generated by the national question, by the Irish question. So I think what is important here, there are a number of points that I find important here. First is the way that this changes our conception of what a revolutionary process is and what the conditions for revolution are. There was a sense in the Communist Manifesto, and this was maintained in essentially the entire subsequent history of social democracy, though of course you get many breaks from this, many points at which people change their understanding. But this assumption that the material conditions are generated by historical laws, that the material conditions for revolution are generated by historical laws. Whereas here it appears, based on the analysis of the national question, that there are political conditions for revolution, and that these, first of all, that the historical process is uneven, that the historical laws don't determine a linear progression. And then that there are political conditions in the sense that national liberation will be a condition for the development of the class struggle. And then there is the point that the revolutionary subject, the agent that's going to carry out the revolution, it doesn't already exist, in the sense that you can't say that it's just the working class that is already there that will be the revolutionary subject. And once again, this is a kind of very direct shift from the Communist Manifesto, in the sense that the Communist Manifesto says that workers are brought together in increasing numbers by the process of capitalist development. They're brought together in the factories, they're brought together in the cities, and they naturally form associations. And the way that they're brought together in the factory generates forms of the basis of forms of organization. This association becomes the basis of creating organizations, which will then become the organizations of class struggle, which will then be able to seize political power. And so in this sense, the revolutionary subject is also being created by the process of capitalist development, guided by these historical laws. But this idea that there is a division, an antagonism within the working class that is holding back its revolutionary subjectivity, even though it's organized, which is specified, that suggests that the revolutionary subject isn't what already exists. It's not something you could identify as a sociological object that's part of the relations of the existing society, but it has to be actively constructed. And so once again, this is the point where there is a political condition, a political process of construction of the revolutionary subject. And so I think that this is sort of these are the underlying conceptual questions that we have to pose about advancing towards socialism, in the sense that it was a kind of basic, a fundamental starting point for most of the history of the socialist movement, to say that we are advancing towards socialism because of the laws of history. And there's a very clear ideological purpose for that kind of claim, to say that history is on our side and that our victory is inevitable. And you can understand, I began by talking about defeat. You can understand that in the constant experience of defeat, which is the fate of anybody committed to a better world, you will constantly encounter defeat, you will constantly experience defeat. And so to maintain a faith that the outcome has already been determined and that it has been scientifically determined, and we know that in the end there is victory, that has a clear function. but it also introduces some obstacles, because when you rely on historical laws as the motor, as the driving force that advances us towards socialism, then we aren't able to understand the causes of previous defeats. We aren't able to understand how entirely new kinds of organization, entirely new kinds of ways of acting politically may both emerge, and we will have to recognize them and figure out how to relate to them, adopt them, and that there will be a sequence that we have not predicted that we need to adapt ourselves to. And so I think, first of all, this means coming to a different kind of relationship to the history of the great 20th century revolutions and the idea of the socialist transition. We have to be able to deal with the fact that the socialist revolutions happened in the places that they weren't supposed to happen, and that they didn't turn out the way they were supposed to. And why did that happen? You know, for the history of Marxism, we have many different kinds of positions. Some of them are about the wrong person being in charge. Some of them, once again, are about the historical laws weren't realized because, once again, it happened in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I think there's a deeper question about what kind of organizational forms and what understanding of transition and socialism were active in these moments, and can they still be sustained today? Or do we need to transform some of our ideas? For example, the idea that organization means a party, a political party, which then takes political power by seizing the state. That was the assumed model. And the problem that in the great 20th century revolutions was that when that happened, the party became the state. And there was a fusion between this political form, this revolutionary political form, and the form of the state, which had the residual characteristics of the capitalist state. And so what do you do about the fact that there is this fusion between a revolutionary organization and then the form of coercion that is supposed to be overcome, that is supposed to wither away as the result of the socialist transition? So I think that's something that we need to come to terms with in a way that we haven't. I think that there is a great kind of paradox about the idea of a socialist utopia. And I think this is a theme that's fundamental to the conference, which is, you know, Marx makes the point about recipes for the kitchens of the future. And we can take that in a very general way about how can we predict, you know, what it will look like and things like that. But I think there's a deeper paradox, which is that when we talk about socialism, we're talking very much about the idea of self-governance, of self-rule, the idea that people can govern themselves. This is a fundamental principle. That's the principle that's underlying the idea of the abolition of the state. That was the principle of the Paris Commune. And it's one that is taken up. Lenin's State and Revolution advances such a thesis. The idea is, or to adopt kind of the optimistic version that C.L.R. James gave of one of Lenin's statements, every cook can govern. That's the idea. And so if socialism is characterized by self-rule, how is it that we could now prescribe the social forms, the forms of life, the forms of social organization that would characterize a society in which people rule themselves, in which presumably they are the ones who formulate these institutions? And the part of the problem there is that we don't actually really know what human equality looks like. We don't know what self-rule looks like because we have had a long history of class societies a long history of unequal societies. And so we don't know what that is. And it will have to be invented. So we have to be able to conceive of political processes which start now. And this is not the same as prefiguring socialism. It's the idea that we need to have political processes that start now that recognize the capacity of people to think and invent new forms of life. And to a certain extent, previous organizational forms were a way of trying to do that, but then there's a certain sense in which they began to undermine that, as I said, with the model of the party becoming the state. So I'll just end by saying, I think that the lesson that we can draw from this theoretically and from this historical experience is that history is not on our side. In fact, what is the most likely outcome is that socialism will not happen. And I think that once we have recognized that, it's in fact then that we become truly aware of the need for struggle and the need for reinvention and creation of new forms of politics, new modes of politics that will be adequate to our historical situation.
I think Azad, you're freezed.
Asad, I
It
think.
seemed like a concluding remark, but feels I think that was not completely it.
Yeah, we should ask. Can we get to Asad? It's a very dramatic way to end.
Did I cut out? Did I cut out?
It was. Yes, you did.
You
Oh,
did,
You're
but at a
saying that
lovely
history was not
spot.
on our side, that socialism will not be the likely outcome, and then you
Then it
freeze.
stopped.
So you left us
Well,
with
yeah.
a lot of anxiety there.
Okay, so I'll just to relieve everyone's anxiety, let's say, socialism is not the most likely outcome. Once we recognize that, then I think we understand the stakes of the struggle, the necessity of the struggle, and we recognize the extent to which we have to be capable of both inventing and recognizing new ways of doing politics. That when we see this happening, we have to be able to engage with it, we have to be able to intervene in it, and that we have to be able to produce new ways of doing politics that are adequate to this historical situation. So that's maybe a better note to end.
Thank you so much, Azad. That was very stimulating. We'll not take much more time before turning to Holly. So Holly, it's up to you for the next 20 minutes.
Okay. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Mic's on. Everything good? Okay. So hi, everybody. I would like to thank the HM Montreal Organizing Committee for inviting me to speak on the panel. And I'm really happy to help kick off the conference with this theme of transitioning away from capitalism towards a socialist future. I also want to thank Bob and Asad for two wonderful talks. And, you know, sometimes people say that, but I really did, I found both of them quite moving and thoughtful. So I want to thank both of you. So last year I was really revved up to speak on this topic, thinking in terms of utopia and transition. And to a degree, this year I felt a bit disoriented. But perhaps the conference is even more urgent in our current circumstances. So as Bob pointed out, this year has had its exhilarating political moments, particularly the uprisings against racist police murder in the United States. You know, just to overview the nightmarish isolation of the pandemic in the United States, we have had this sport hunting of protesters, a market-driven week-long Texas winter blackout at the height of the pandemic here. So if you want to talk about capitalism not being able to deliver, that's a really good example of it. And we've had to deal with work speed-ups amid wild levels of unemployment and the dark carnival of QAnon in the Trump presidency, vaccine nationalism, and now a COVID crisis in India, simultaneous to Israel's genocidal attacks on Gaza, which I'm happy have been put on pause, at least for the moment. So the sheer density of calamities is unbearable. And more than ever, we need to jettison capitalism and reorganize global production on a democratic basis. However, though the need is great, the infrastructure of working class resistance, as ASAD pointed out, is weak at best, and I would say likely even more so in the US. On top of that, there's no international network capable of building the bridges that are necessary to end capitalism. So the task is enormous, but today, unlike my co-panelists, I'm not going to take on that enormous task, and I'm going to narrow my comments to one small obstacle that I feel we're facing in building revolutionary organs of struggle. Be those revolutionary organs, parties, organizations, centers, collectives. This problem is a seemingly evergreen impasse in left politics that could be summed up as, and it's something that both ASAD and I have written on, the identity politics versus class politics debate. So I'd like to argue today that the framing of this problem, identity politics versus class politics, is distorted and misleading, in part because the term identity politics is overly vague, and in part because what constitutes the class politics that supposedly challenges these identity politics rarely explicitly involves a Marxist understanding of class. I think that the second conundrum raised by this debate is how to answer these questions politically rather than ethically. In other words, what are the conceptual, organizational, and relational failures generating these bad faith arguments? And how do we solve the problem collectively instead of merely posing ethical arguments about individual speech behaviors or individual habits of interaction? Today, I'm going to mostly focus on the conceptual failures in these conversations, but I'm going to hint at their politics and even hopefully, and only hint at some aspects of their partial material origins. So first, the term identity politics is fatally ambiguous. It doesn't describe a coherent set of politics or even an attitude. It is, at this point, largely a term of derision. In the soft sense, the phrase identity politics is used to heap scorn upon the neoliberal co-optation of anti-oppression politics, for example, when the CIA uses feminist language to promote imperialism, or corporations use struggles for liberation to enhance surplus value. But the term is also deployed by some self-described proponents of class struggle who describe any attempt at all to address anti-oppression politics within socialist politics as mere identity politics. This argument often takes the form of a particular complaint that addressing the wrongs suffered by particular groups oppressed under capitalism detracts from the universal general well-being of the lowest common denominator among the working population. A third meaning of identity politics that you'll find in conversations refers to a genuine complication for global organizing. And that's when anti-oppression politics takes the form of a strict adherence to standpoint epistemology, where one can only take action to end oppression if one suffers that particular oppression. So this is indeed a position with some popularity within neoliberal social justice politics, but sometimes revolutionaries insist on this position as well. However, the effect of this epistemological standpoint epistemology has much different consequences for neoliberal politics than it does for revolutionary politics. The first phenomenon I described, where capitalists and the capitalist state posture as kind of woke, might be better described, instead of calling it identity politics and making comments that way, we could possibly describe it as the neoliberal co-optation of legitimate anti-oppression politics. So we could think of it in those terms. Whereas when bosses are pressured to make changes in the workplace, instead of calling that identity politics, we could call it diversity reforms, and we could think of it along those lines. The second use of the term identity politics, where oppressed people are derided for challenging their own oppression by those who consider their struggles a threat to an imaginary primordial class unity, as ASAD was actually, I think getting at in his talk, where there's this idea that there's this this working class that exists empirically in, I guess if I want to pull out Sartrean terms, right? The class in itself instead of the class for itself. So the folks so that particular type of politics, where this kind of politics already has a name. That's just simply the revolutionary struggle against oppression. So when we're talking about, some kind of, I don't know, identity politics having some kind of violation of that primordial unity of the working class, this is something that I think that we really need to all challenge these assumptions on a number of grounds. The third type of political activity that we call identity politics, where standpoint epistemology is strictly maintained, that can take two forms. The first is when a contingency of oppressed people argue that solidarity with outsiders is impossible. But we don't need the phrase identity politics for this, because we already have a name for that, and that name is separatism. So the idea of the separatists, a huge term from the 1970s. And the weak version of the standpoint epistemology argument is where separatism isn't pursued, but where strict standpoint epistemologies are insisted upon. And you might hear this with revolutionaries being advised to stay in their lane, not talk out of turn. We might think of these more along the lines of ethical intra-organizing problems within the class, feelings of not being listened to. At times it's, are we failing to ask oppressed people to speak to their own experiences? Are the oppressed people who were organizing amongst frustrated about feelings of exclusion? So those are ways to interact with that problem without, or to deal with the problem, to build without using, kind of throwing out these terms like identity politics. And it should be noted that none of the descriptions that I've given of identity politics reflect the original meaning of the term, which was invented by the radical anti-capitalist Black lesbians of the Combahee River Collective, to describe their need to finally address their own political conditions after a lifetime of intervening on issues of the oppression and exploitation of others with whom they were in solidarity. Their original ideas were never deployed in a way that would be friendly to the, the co-optation of their politics by Coors or Bank of America or the CIA. nor do they refuse to address how capitalism as a mode of production generated Black women's oppression and Black lesbian oppression. Nor did they tell their comrades that it was only morally acceptable to advocate for an oppressed group if one is a member of that particular oppressed group. So we have to recognize the subtle shifts in these terms, or else we're just going to get lost in this kind of arguments where words are overdetermined or have multiple meanings, and we're speaking past one another. So now that that's out of the way, I'd like to turn my attention to the other side of the coin of this debate, and that's the nominal class politics that's opposed to this so-called identity politics. It's the politics that are invoked to defend the class against identity politics. While at times this position is simply workerist, more often than not, the class politics invoked in this debate isn't a Marxist conception of class at all, but I would argue a complaint that anti-oppression politics is somehow disrupting economistic demands for universal reforms, such as universal basic income, or in the United States, Medicare for all, or the Green New Deal. Other times, the invocation of class politics is itself a reactionary populist identity politics, where working families, presumed heterosexual, cisnormative, and at least citizens, if not white, wrest gains from an ill-defined elite. So this conception of class is, in fact, not compatible with a Marxist understanding of class, but is rather a competing form of identity politics where blue-collar folks, be they workers or not, pit themselves against a cosmopolitan elite, be they workers or not. So class here doesn't refer to a position in the capitalist mode of production, but instead implies a singular cultural identity, often a mismatch of populist mid-century nostalgia. One example of this that I think is really emblematic happened a few weeks ago. The Democratic Party operative, Jim Carvell, gave this long screed about the term Latinx, and how terms like Latinx were what he called faculty language, and that this faculty language is a plot to destroy the American working class. So this misconstrual of Marxist politics, or misconstrual, this co-optation of the term class politics, inspired Neil Davidson to revisit Marxist theories of oppression in his last written work. And he argued, and I'm going to quote Neil here, that the central category for Marxists is not class, but mode of production. Davidson then notes the key epistemological distinction between exploitation and oppression. One is mystified and the other sensate. And I'm going to quote Neil Davidson again here. No one experiences exploitation any more than they experience the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. They experience instead the oppression which exploitation involves. But if oppression is the trauma generated from the reality of capitalist exploitation, why is so-called identity politics so widely ridiculed? I believe that there are two reasons for this. The first is that neoliberalism has indeed co-opted the phraseology of proper anti-capitalist, anti-oppression politics. And these terms are often used, sometimes quite sharply, by those who aren't even anti-capitalist. And this is frustrating for us when we're organizing, and we can be honest about that. The second reason that I think is less discussed, at least anymore, is that what is often called identity politics is often a dismissal of women, queer people, and disabled people, and often women, women, queer, and disabled people of color. And that trivialization and infantilization are actually techniques of sexist and anti-queer oppression. So I don't think that it should be any shock that what people clutch pearls at is a term like Latinx, which is used by, it's not a term that was invented in the academy. It was actually invented amongst Latinx, queer, working people of color. But this is actually not a new insight. Judith Butler hit on this problem in her famously contentious 1996 paper, Merely Cultural, which was a challenge to Marxists, but I believe that it was a challenge offered in a spirit of solidarity. Here, Butler notes the dynamic of dismissing queer struggle as cultural distraction, and I'm going to quote Judith Butler here. Whereas class and race struggles are understood as pervasively economic, and feminist struggles are understood to be sometimes economic and sometimes cultural, queer struggles are understood not only to be cultural struggles, but to typify the merely cultural, end quote. Butler goes on to use Marx to remind Marxists that Marxism has a long history of championing a materialist conception of gender, and that it can therefore have a materialist conception of gender complexity and sexuality as well. And I think that what we're seeing in queer social reproduction theory, or Marxist understandings of social reproduction theory that are taking queer reality seriously, I think that we're seeing the promise of this conversation that was first articulated in 1996. So Butler's point here is that it goes against historical materialist thought to insist that there are important economic matters in one sector of life that we need to look at, but that the rest of human experience is some sort of irrelevant idealism. A materialist would look for materialist social relations in the totality of life. And it's actually a kind of Cartesian dualism to think that there's these, material facets, embodied facets of life. And then there's these kind of like airy ideas that float around. Okay. So Butler's argument was in particular a response to the social democratic truism most notably documented, or put forward as a truism, most notably documented in Nancy Fraser's work, that there is a divide between the politics of recognition and the politics of redistribution, and that the latter, the politics of redistribution, is key. In other words, wanting access to gender-affirming healthcare is a matter of the politics of recognition, but wanting access to healthcare is the politics of redistribution. This is where it starts to fall apart for me. As someone interested in the politics of emancipation, in seizing the means of production, not redistributing what the working class has collectively created, the premise is already outside of what I believe to be a useful framework. However, I think that in this case, Butler's point stands. If you can't access healthcare because you're trans, recognition affects redistribution. If you're, for example, a lesbian who has to take their child out of school because they're being bullied, this isn't just a matter of mere recognition of wanting to be seen and heard, but it affects your earnings and your spending. If you can't get your wheelchair over the curb to access the job, it affects your ability to access commodities and hence redistribution. So there's no clean split between the politics of recognition and redistribution. But all of this is only part of the story. there's a political aspect of identity under capitalism that isn't even reducible to anti-oppression politics. Two conditions are at least partly responsible for the proliferation of identities and one could even call social brands under capitalism. And the first is, and this is separate from anti-oppression politics, but it's still something that when people talk about identity politics that they are referring to and even complaining about. And this is that the reification of social relations in its entirety. Under capitalism, we don't experience things as processes or relationships. We don't experience things as existing fluidly within the world. Everything, every quality of self, every quality of community actually as well, becomes a thing. Our labor power is reified. We consider it a thing because we sell it. Our gender is reified because we sell it on a gendered labor market. And we are raised with expectations as well of what we're going to do with this gender that we contain somehow, this thing that we contain. But this is no different for non-oppressed people, right? So this is something that people like to point out in anti-oppression politics, but it isn't any different for non-oppressed people. You know, we have mommy bloggers under capitalism, incels, football dads, heterosexuals. We have tankies that are insistent upon their identities. Under capitalism, every aspect of life is capable of being reified and put into distribution and put into circulation. So it's only those who aren't oppressed because they don't feel out of tune with the world under capitalist, or they don't feel out of tune with capitalist expectations. It's only they who are naturalizing what they reify in themselves, right? So that it seems that oppressed people can't. So it seems like there's something different that oppressed people are doing when they're constantly talking about what they're dealing with their identities. So this leads us to the second condition that leads to the proliferation of identities under capitalism. And I think that this is particular in the US, it's not particular to the US, but it's particularly strong in the US. And that's that there's contradictions between the ideological emphasis on individualism coupled with extreme levels of alienation. So neoclassical economists take Robinson Crusoe as their starting point. So we shouldn't be surprised when we find ourselves isolated and alone on our island. And what's more, oppression erodes us, right? It erodes our sense of self. It erodes our identities. It erodes our ability to grasp who we are. So we shouldn't be surprised that in these moments of crisis, people start looking for reified identities in order to be able to hold themselves in front of themselves and take a look at who they are and maybe where they fit in the world. And as David McNally pointed out in his book, Monsters of the Market, the working day leaves us zombified. So all of this turn to identity, even beyond anti-oppression movements and their relationship to these sometimes genuine, sometimes reactionary appeals to class. It makes sense that in this calamitous capitalist society that wears us down, that we're attempting to rebuild ourselves into more durable objects. And it makes sense that our interactions with one another, and therefore our attempts at political organizing and politically organizing ourselves into a collective capable of ending capitalism, would be fraught, and that it would be difficult under these circumstances. Similar to ASAD's point that we don't quite know what this is going to look like. So one small step that I believe that we can take to addressing these kinds of organizing issues is to kind of stand at a distance and carefully assess how we're framing our organizing questions, like, you know, identity politics versus class politics. And when we look at them, insist on a Marxist approach to anti-capitalism and to avoid the pitfalls of allowing the co-optation of our key ideas by both, on one hand, populist reactionaries, and on the other hand, neoliberal moralizers. So that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ollie. This was, again, a very stimulating talk. Time is, again, not always on our side, so it's starting to get closer to 8:30. We might stretch a few minutes, but I was first gonna, give a first round of exchange between all of you as quick response, but maybe we can get to that since we haven't had so much questions yet, but maybe I'll make sure to get to the questions and then allowing you, depending on the time, we can get back to all of you. A first question that we got was in reaction to your talk, Bob. Basically, it kind of referred to your diagnostic that we should cope with the reality that capitalism has lost its steam, that it's lost its steam in terms of its own dynamism, and that we are in a kind of a situation of terminal crisis of capitalism. The question kind of tries to say that that's not the first time in the history of Marxism that this kind of claim has been made, and that, for example, during the Great Depression, a lot of the classical Marxist tradition, and even prior, has kind of framed it as socialism or barbarism, and then we got the post-war boom and led to a profound disorientation of the Marxist movement, and try to grapple with what was this unprecedented dynamism while we thought it was in its final decay. So the question that was put forward was, are we not facing a danger of falling again into that trap? And as capitalism can rebound in the form of new, budgetary deficits and, Keynesianism didn't refer, but some talk about this with the Biden plan, for example. What about green capitalism? Is that a possibility? Or what about the Chinese model? Is that something that can take us out of this mess? So that's the first question.
Should I go into it? Okay. We obviously don't have a lot of time, and asking me that question is really a dangerous thing because it sort of opens up the possibility of blabbing on for a very long time, since much of my own.
Yeah, I should have said, you probably have about more or less 4 to 5 minutes.
Yeah, I don't think I should even take that long. I think the question is extremely good and extremely important, especially as I spent much of my own political life in a movement that was, as it were, committed to capitalist crisis, capitalist collapse, the inability of capitalism to provide the basis for reforms. In other words, that I was in and have been part of a movement which basically had the opposite problem from the one I'm referring to now. I won't use the word Trotskyism, but it's conceivable that that could be of some relevance in some ways, which I have, of course, in a certain way been part of in a big way, and although perhaps very heterodox forms of this. I think just the quick response to the point, because the point is, as an absolute point, is extremely well taken. I don't want to really argue against it, but I think what I want to say is that it's important to recognize shifts, as it were, in the era or epoch that one finds oneself in order to take proper cognizance of the kind of politics that's on the agenda, that's required. And I think the problem has not been that, well, BRENNER putting forward this catastrophism, is essentially putting day-to-day struggles off the agenda, and the end of it's either socialism or barbarism, and we can wait to see which one it is, a recipe for passivity. I think why I'm trying to make the point that I did is because I think the reality has been that we have for a long time been in a period of ever worsening slowdown, whatever anyone has said. And this has engulfed not just, the US, not just the Europe and Japan, but is what I think very importantly, also engulfed the dynamic East Asia, NICS, China, and so forth. So that is a first thing, just to make the distinction between the period we've been in and what was like the period, for example, that I grew up in, where the opposite seemed to be the case. And so to start out with that recognition, because what it definitely means is that the kind of gains that were kind of normal to a period of the post-war boom for part of the population, that needs to be made very explicit. Part of the world, that needs to be very explicit. That situation is no longer here, it's the opposite. That leads to a recognition of the failure of capitalism. It gives an opportunity to point out that, capitalism, and I'm not too worried about saying, well, capitalism has only failed for the last 30, 40 years, or to provide the ability to provide gains for a huge part of the world that has been crisis for a huge part of the population. I'm not too worried about the overgeneralization there. And at the same time, I also think that it's crucial to kind of to register the to register not the possible pessimism that could come from seeing how much more difficult it is to win partial struggles, in a sense, get things started before they're extinguished. If we look at what's going on in Bessemer, that kind of difficulty is very much front and center. How can you fight there when basically there's so much already organized, against you? But if we just look around, the second point I wanted to make, in addition to the stagnation and crisis, is that we've gotten in this situation very much what we might have hoped for and expected, which are huge, discontinuous mass struggles that are organized, that are come out, so to speak, of nowhere, but which have not proceeded, bit by bit, but discontinuously. The discontinuity, in other words, has not posed as big a problem as one might have expected. So there's a certain ability to sustain an optimism. If you look at what was just going on before the pandemic, the gigantic struggles across the world. So if we keep in mind those things, we don't, I mean, we don't neglect the possibility that there'll be new booms and so forth. I would say, sub point here, think there's a big step from thinking that the Biden administration might be doing something very unexpected to many of us, which I myself think it is, and to move to this conclusion that the ability to take those steps, recognizing the bankruptcy of bipartisan politics for decades and trying to figure out a way not to lose the next election, is leading to political experiments. But I think it remains to be seen that under the best of circumstances, Keynesianism or industrial policy in the West, in the United States, can actually overcome the system-wide pressures downward. So final point would simply be, I don't think I think we can take for the time being that we have stagnation crisis. Take for time being the unexpected point that we have discontinuous mass struggles that have been incredibly inspiring and don't seem to fit a kind of science, a Marxist science that might have been developed in the period before World War I or recapitulated again and again since then. So the final thing I think we have, which is very difficult, and I think this was, I take this to be the kind of bottom line of what ASAD was trying to say. The fact of discontinuity brings about social relationships, social solidarities on bases and with characteristics that are quite unpredictable. And it somehow, the job of Marxists like ourselves, like anyone who's going to be participating in this sort of movement, is to kind of realize, this has got to be pablum. On the one hand, I don't think ASAD was saying the fact of the novelty of each situation meant that we know nothing, or that a lot of what we know is still very, very applicable. It's just that so much of the open side of the question is unknown, that is, it tells us that that is the place where, in a sense, we have to apply, and I guess I use the term advisedly, recipes from the past, but that these are completely, have to be understood as completely incomplete and requiring transformation. That I can't deny, that is about as pablum as you could get, but it's about as good as I could do for the minute.
All right, thank you, Bob. I'll go right away to another question. I'll go in the order. There's one for ASAD and one for Ollie, and I'll try to be a bit stricter on time because we're having interpreters that cannot go over their shifts by more than 10 to 15 minutes. So, I'll just read this this other question we just received. So, dear ASAD, following from what you were saying that history doesn't have much to offer, in terms of that socialism isn't the solution either, agree with you there. It'd be wonderful if you can elaborate more on what you see as some seedlings of the new models of emancipation, if I can put it in that way.
So in many respects, Bob was just posing a similar question, taking up some of these points. I mean, so I would distinguish claims about history. So on the one hand, history is a key concept in Marxism, in the sense that there was always this conception that there is a historical process and we know how it's going to go. And that in that we find these, our politics is located in that. And that I think is not true. So I think now we know that is not true. And we can know that theoretically, and we can see that that's not how things turned out. However, history as what we study to see how people did politics before, I think is very valuable to understand. In what sense? It's not in the sense, and once again, this is what you would get from many Marxists and many Marxist kinds of organizations, would be to say, for example, I was talking about Marx on the Irish question. He would say, okay, he identified there's this colonial level, there's this colonial relation, and then you have the lever, and then you have this and that. So we got to figure out what's the same set of relationships now. That I think is not the right approach. I think the right approach is to say Marx had a way of trying to grasp what was going on in his moment, and that we need to do the same thing for our moment. That we need to have a way of producing concepts that can understand this specific historical situation, and of maintaining basic principles of emancipatory politics. And I think that's what we see when we look throughout history at different kinds of political events and movements. We see that they put forward emancipatory principles, principles of human dignity and freedom and justice and equality. They are advanced by these movements, but while there's this element that's the same, there's also something that's very specific and very different in the sense that they respond to their situations. And it shows that part of politics is the capacity for being able to understand and think about and invent ways of acting in your situation. And that's what we want to repeat. That's my view.
Thank you so much, Azad. So the final response will be to you, Ollie, to this rather a bit longer question here. I'll just be reading. So it seems the difficulty with identity politics that confronts members of majority white groups arises in part from ignoring the importance of settler, colonial, and racial capitalism. So why is it that left writers largely ignore this area of analysis, which zeroes in on the vital place, number one, of historic and ongoing dispossession of indigenous resources and of land-backed claims, and two, the reliance of capital on global cheap labor, persons from the global south obliged to become economic climate refugees for low wages, disproportionately hit by COVID-19 in workplaces where they are unprotected, unable to stop working, and located in sites of where the virus spread. So why is the old and new left failing to take up the responsibility white people have for affirming settler colonial history and current realities? The climate change crisis founded on extractivism and destruction of the planet, founded on dispossession, insane vaccine nationalism, and disproportionate harm to racialized people.
Well, I can't really answer why people on the left don't do something, because that would mean I would be speaking for many people. But I will agree with the question, but it seems more of a comment than a question, really. In that I do think that that is the answer. I think that the answer is to look at colonial violence, to look at racial capitalism, to take and also to look at not just social reproduction, but social reproduction as it is occurring under capitalism throughout the world, and it's different in different locations. In different locations, to listen to the struggles of people on the ground. And in my book, I talk about listening to that what ideology is kind of going through experience on the ground, making sense of the world, and taking that terrain that you traverse and bringing it into your worldview. And the development of capitalism, which grounded completely in colonial violence, is different depending on different locations. And that's why we need to listen to the many different histories on the ground. So I would say that one of the things that I know is not productive is what I mentioned, this kind of sort of total reduction of contemporary politics, political problems to this, very flat understanding of identity politics versus real and authentic class politics. I mean, to a certain degree, it sounds like a bit of a straw man, but this is kind of how the problem presents itself to us all too often. So that's the best that I can do. I agree with you. And one of the reasons why in my talk I focused more on genders, because ASAD has a book where he talks about some of the similar questions that are focused on race. And so I thought that we were going to be, maybe having a back and forth in that sense, or anyway, so that's one of the reasons why my talk kind of laid heavy on the queer and social reproduction side. To actually comment on the other two questions very briefly, it sounds like what we're talking about is that Marxism isn't teleological, and that, in part, that it isn't teleological, and that many of our movements have, for the sake of psychological comfort, relied on this idea that maybe it is, even when we state that we don't necessarily believe that. And so maybe that's something that we need to deal with on a fuller level, that Marxism isn't teleological, that we're not sure how this ends, and as I think both Bob and ASAD were saying, that we have to really take seriously what's going on, the difficulties that we're facing, so that we can move forward, not with this kind of sense of false optimism, but with a kind of a realistic look at the way things stand.
So thanks to all of you. That was very fantastic, very stimulating discussions. I should have also said that there was more very generous thank yous in terms for all your talks than questions. Of course, I would have had a lot of my own to bring back to bridge a lot of your own interventions, but unfortunately, as I said, time is not on our side. So, but clearly these themes will be picked up again throughout multiple conferences and panels that are coming up in the next few days. So again, everyone, thanks a lot for participating to this. I'm in a blur right now. So thanks for all for participating at this opening panel, and see you tomorrow starting at 11:30 if I'm correct. All right, so everyone have a good night.
Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.